Hello everybody and welcome to this first ever virtual Swiss-US Energy Innovation Day. I'm Diego Sigrist, Innovation Associate at SwissNext Boston, and I'm very pleased to welcome so many attendees from both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you so much for joining us here virtually. I'm really looking forward to the upcoming presentations as well as the virtual networking sessions. First of all, I would like to thank all the people who made this conference possible despite the difficult circumstances. In particular, I would like to thank our partners, the Swiss Federal Office of Energy and SwissNext San Francisco, as well as my colleagues Alicia, Lemon, and Alex for their incredible work. As you may know, the Swiss-US Energy Innovation Days usually are an in-person conference, which would have taken place in Switzerland in August this year. Due to the unpredictable development and duration of the coronavirus pandemic, however, we decided to postpone the in-person conference to 2021. Although this is a pity, I'm very pleased that we are able to organize a virtual alternative, because this way we can really keep up the momentum, which is really important in my opinion. Because even though we're in the middle of a global health crisis, which is likely followed by a recession, other pressing issues facing our planet and people, such as climate change, for example, also require present action. So I'm really looking forward to a fruitful exchange of knowledge and ideas from both sides of the Atlantic over the next couple of hours. In this year's edition, we focus on 3 topics: energy in buildings, digitalization in the energy sector, and investing in future energy technologies. And as I said, it is the first time that we're hosting this conference virtually, so please bear with us if we face any technical problems. Regarding the format of this event, there will be 3 webinar sessions, each with 3 to 4 presentations, and all 3 webinar sessions will take place on Zoom, and you can use the same Zoom link to join the webinar sessions. After each presentation, there's going to be a Q&A session for 5 minutes. So all attendees, please use the Q&A chat to ask questions and to vote for other questions during the presentations. We will then select the questions with the most votes and ask them to the speakers. In between the webinar sessions, we are going to switch to the Remo platform for the virtual networking. And you all got a link with which you can access the Remo networking room. Additionally, we will also post the link in the chat. Now, before we begin with the opening keynote, I would like to say a few words about SwissNext. SwissNext is the global network of Swiss science and innovation consulates with offices in Boston, New York City, San Francisco, Shanghai, Bangalore, and Rio de Janeiro. The core mission of the SwissNext network is to connect our Swiss partners to thriving ecosystems worldwide. So we really want to inspire new ideas and to promote knowledge exchange. And usually our Swiss partners are Swiss higher education institutions, research institutions, startups, and other Swiss organizations. So I really think the Swiss-US Energy Innovation Day is a perfect example of how we connect the dots between Switzerland and the US. I'm now very excited to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Mr. Benoît Revaz. Benoît is the director of the Swiss Federal Office of Energy, which is responsible for practical implementation of the Energy Strategy 2050. The Energy Strategy 2050, for those of you who don't know it, was accepted by the Swiss electorate in 2017, and it aims to increase the energy efficiency, to promote the use of renewable energy, and to withdraw from the use of nuclear energy. So without further ado, Benoît, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you, Diego, and good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I hope that you and your beloved one are safe and healthy despite the very special situation we are having right now. I wish to thank SwissNext Boston for organizing today's event. And it's my pleasure to open this virtual Swiss-US Energy Innovation Day 2020. Last year, the 6th edition of the SUEID took place in Texas, where almost 100 participants from various fields attended. And this event provided an excellent platform for exchange of information and experience. And as Diego just said, today's event is dedicated to 3 aspects of energy developments: energy innovations in, around, and between the built environment, digitalization in the energy sector, and new funding schemes and investments in future energy technologies. The COVID-19 crisis has revealed many unsustainable aspects of the world's economy, and this cannot just be reinstated. Stimulus investment must avoid locking in unsustainable economic activity, particularly in the field of energy. And the energy transition creates jobs and economic value. This is even more crucial today as our economies face a recession. As Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, said after co-hosting an online global ministerial meeting on economic recovery, he said it's crucial to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. Although emissions fell as a result of the 2008 global financial crisis, they soon rebounded sharply, and we must learn from that experience. And indeed, putting clean energy at the heart of the stimulus plans is an excellent strategy for revitalizing economies while building a more secure and sustainable energy future. Switzerland is currently recasting its CO2 and energy laws in order to reach its target under the Paris Agreement and achieve climate neutrality by 2050. Our energy strategy 2050 promotes increased energy efficiency and the expansion of renewable energies. In Switzerland, the building, mobility, and industry sectors are responsible for the majority of emissions, 40 million tons of CO2 out of 46 million tons emitted by Switzerland each year. Therefore, we are tightening efficiency standards for energy using products, vehicles, and buildings. Our building refurbishment program, for which we allocate up to 450 million Swiss francs per year. This money is a revenue from our CO2 tax, and our refurbishment program focuses on insulation and energy supply. Since building standards are a cantonal remit, getting all the cantons on board is not always easy. And in order to replace the gradual phasing out of nuclear, we have ramped up incentives to increase mainly photovoltaics, biomass, hydropower, and to a certain extent, wind energy. Switzerland also actively supports energy research and innovation pilots and demonstration projects. Next year, we want to start a new funding research program, the Swiss Energy Research for the Energy Transition, the SUEID program, which addresses key research topics of the Energy Strategy 2050. And to achieve climate neutrality, digitalization is a decisive factor. This is why we have created a digital innovation office in our ministry, and the growing digitalization brings change in the energy sector. Thanks to digitalization, distributed production, storage, and demand-side management are made possible, and new players emerge, new services emerge, interaction becomes more complex. Dear participants, to achieve the energy transition, the commitment of all is required. Governments, market players, civil society. Today's event is the opportunity to exchange on these decisive issues, and I look very much forward to the upcoming inspiring presentations and discussions. Thank you for your attention and wish you an excellent meeting.
I now have the pleasure of handing over the floor to my colleague, Alicia, who will moderate the first webinar session. So please enjoy the first 3 presentations.
Thank you, Diego. And I want to keep the focus on our wonderful speakers, but first let me introduce myself. My name is Alicia Evangelista, and I'm the head of innovation at Swiss Next Boston. Diego has been an incredible organizer, and I've had the privilege to watch him organize, and now I have the privilege to introduce to you our first speaker in our first block. So Robert Leland is the Associate Lab Director of Scientific Computing and Energy Analysis at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the United States. And he'll be presenting on an unprecedented analysis of Los Angeles's clean energy transformation. Robert, the floor is yours.
Well, and I just want to thank Benoît and the organizers. This is, I think, my 3rd time at the conference, and I've enjoyed each one quite a bit. And it's nice to see a number of colleagues that I know from previous sessions. I wanted to tell you just a bit about a major study that we're doing for the city of Los Angeles that's called LA 100. And this is a study to consider what it would take for the city of Los Angeles to get to 100% renewable provision for their electrical grid by the year 2045. It's a very ambitious goal, and we're doing a lot of great technical work to support them in thinking that through. Let's see. These are some of the things that make this study unique. The first is that LA has its own utility. And so that's both an opportunity and a challenge. It means that they need to figure out how to balance supply and load 100% of the time across their own infrastructure. And that is a critical element of this challenge of figuring out how to get to 100% renewable supply by 2045. Also, as part of the study, they have taken on the challenge of thinking through the environmental impact of whatever changes they make and how the economy and rates might respond. And this is really driven home by our meetings with a large advisory group, about 30 people, institutions represented there, all the way from Greenpeace to the folks that operate the utility infrastructure and pretty much everything in between. So those are quite animated discussions as we hash out what ought to be done here. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. Okay. So as I mentioned, LA is its own utility, and so they need to balance electricity supply and demand at all times. And in order to do this study, it was felt that we needed to generate a level of resolution well beyond anything that had been done in a similar study in the past. And then, of course, to make it an objective and transparent stakeholder-based process. That's the advisory group dynamic that I was just mentioning. And it's critical to understand here that our study, the NREL study, does not present recommendations or suggest policies. We're doing the analysis across a whole set of scenarios, and that will go to the government of the city of Los Angeles, and they will decide what policies to implement based on that. This next chart shows you the 9 scenarios that we're considering in the study. And there actually is a reference case that we're evaluating as well, so it's really 10. Each scenario is associated with one of the columns here in the chart. And along the left-hand side, you can see all the various different dimensions that are varied in order to create these different scenarios. And the block of the first 4 columns there, labeled moderate load electrification, assumes that the electrification in the LA basin proceeds at a moderate rate. So for example, we assume about a 30% penetration of electric vehicles by the year 2045. The 4 columns to the right of that are have a green header are the high electrification scenarios, where, for example, we assume 80% penetration of electrical vehicles. And then I'll call your attention back on the blue to the first 2 columns, just by way of example. The SB 100 scenario is based on the Senate bill at the state level, which mandates 100% or mandates certain targets by 2045. And in fact, just within the last day or so, that legislation has been approved in the state Senate. And Los Angeles will track that. And so this is a very mainstream scenario, if you like. The next column to the right, called LA Leads, is a more aggressive version of things. So the timeline is brought into 2035 to get to 100% renewable. No fossil fuels are allowed as backups in the SB 100 scenario. Some natural gas will persist as a backup. In the LA Leads scenario, there will be nothing that can generate emissions, no biofuels, etc. So that gives you a flavor of the kind of variation in the different scenarios that are being considered. And this next chart here is intended to give you a sense of the complexity of the simulations that are going on here as we model this, this urban area. So the flow chart in the middle is a lot to follow, but you can see that the study is considering all kinds of different elements. We have to model the load. We're doing that in a great deal of detail. So you see that in the upper left with the blue boxes. We've actually considered over 600,000 properties in the city of Los Angeles and over 7 million buildings. We're not using averages of rooftop solar potential, for example, across the city. We're actually modeling every building in the city. That would require a huge amount of computing power. It does, and we're able to do that because we're running these all on our supercomputer at the laboratory. Similarly, if you look to the right, we're modeling all of the wires in the distribution grid for the city, and running over 25 million detailed engineering simulations of that. We're looking at resource provisioning and production cost modeling, how you would build out this infrastructure, depending on constraints about whether you can change the transmission infrastructure or not. That's a very politically constrained consideration, because it's very difficult to you might have a simulation that suggests that you should run a new transmission line through a neighborhood, but of course they may object. And so we have to consider all kinds of different possible eventualities here. We're also looking at the economic impact that's down in the lower right on jobs and the general economic climate. And as I mentioned, we're looking at the environmental analysis, air quality, greenhouse gas emissions over the long term, and environmental justice, where those impacts will fall within the city relative to economic means, etc. All in all, we've run about 100 million different simulations across these various different considerations. We're now in the process of aggregating that into a picture of the contrasts between these various different scenarios. What I was going to show you next was a really interesting animated simulation of all of this, and just discovered about a half an hour ago that there were some sensitive details in that we in fact can't share publicly yet. And so I placed this static picture just to give you a flavor of some of the results that we're arriving at. Had I been able to show you the animation, what you would have seen is a simulation of 3 days of dynamic power provision across the city, across all of the different sources of generation: solar, wind, biomass, natural gas, curtailment, etc. You would have seen wind power energy coming in from Colorado and Wyoming, because the city actually owns infrastructure in those other states that they use to provide energy back into the city. We would have seen transactions between the various different parts of the grid. And it's a really cool visualization. It's akin to the things that I've shown in the past year that we've modeled at the national level, the grid, but we're now doing it in similar detail down at the LA basin level. The picture that I'm showing here is actually some of the static results from the transmission modeling work. And the color coding represents the implied degree of change under a given scenario. So the blue or teal colors are transmission lines or regions where we don't anticipate much change being needed. And the orange or brown areas are where there is a significant mismatch in the bandwidth and the power needed according to the scenario and the existing infrastructure. So you can see from this overlay that there is substantial amount of change required in the transmission infrastructure. And that's the kind of planning data that would be very helpful to the city in going forward. I did want to just briefly share with you some preliminary insights. And that is that, for example, there are multiple cost-effective pathways to get to 90% renewable energy. It's the last 10% that is particularly difficult, and where we anticipate that new technologies will need to be deployed. There are a lot of uncertainties about how that last 10% would be covered. And a general thing that we've seen in the study that we've done so far is that the more options you have, the broader the number of eligible solutions, the better you can do at optimizing the cost. And we've also learned that looking at the cross-economy impacts of all of these different effects is actually a very intricate problem and requires quite a bit of careful analysis. Just a few closing thoughts. The LA 100 study offers unprecedented scale, scope, and detail for energy planners. And it's just the first step. We're already in conversation with several other major urban areas within the US, and we believe that the next set of analyses will be even more complex and detailed as we learn better how to further integrate these models. In order to do all of this, it's really essential to have some sort of high performance computing capability, that the sort that you would find at a national laboratory. And we do find that this is helping us to identify the characteristics of the new technologies that will be needed to meet market demand as more and more cities adopt 100% renewable targets. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Robert. That was very intriguing and very complex. I think we have a few questions for you around the complexity of the analyses that you're doing. Starting with one, regarding the last 10% that you talked about, the 10% that will employ new technologies, do you have specific technologies in mind that have potential, for example, fusion power, or is this a theoretical set of technologies?
I think the sense of new there is really not, entirely whole cloth new technologies, but ones that haven't been brought to maturity or deployed at scale. So, for example, in the storage area, Los Angeles actually has a lot of what's called pumped hydro storage capability. We saw that when we visited Switzerland a couple years ago. And LA actually is blessed with having some of that. But there are, of course, new battery technologies that are coming forth all the time. And in order to get the footprint down, you may need a more efficient battery, or you may need better discharge times than we currently have. So we're anticipating some improvements over the next couple of decades in battery technologies and projection. Similarly, hydrogen fuel cells make a role in that. one of the intriguing prospects is that in order to prepare for the worst day, Los Angeles actually will probably have to overbuild their renewable infrastructure, have a higher peak capacity for solar or wind than they would need on the average day. So what do you do with that extra energy when you're not deploying it in the moment? Well, one of the things that we've been talking with them about is using that energy, to generate compounds, hydrogen or ammonia, or things that store energy and that have other industrial values. So what does that process look like? And can we change the economics of the last 10% by how we use the power that would otherwise be curtailed? So that's the sort of thing that we're looking at.
Fantastic. We have a number of questions rolling in, but we only have about 2 more minutes. So I'm going to give you one more that actually came from one of your fellow panelists, Duane Jonlin. Do you have examples of results from the analysis that were surprising or unexpected?
Because, and I'm of course representing the work of a large team of people. We have dozens of people working on this who are true experts in their field, and I am not. I get the impression that the results have not particularly surprised them because they've been thinking deeply about some of these issues for a long time. But perhaps in the degree, how much can you expect to get from combining solar and storage, and what are the actual constraints there? I think they're learning some good things there. I'd say overall, the thing that has surprised the team the most is just how challenging it has been to wrangle all of the data here. The number of different sources of data and the scale at which they've had to do that has been arguably the major challenge for them. And that has to do with how well the tools are integrated and therefore how much data needs to be transformed, et cetera. So that's something that we're getting a lot better at. And we think that that skill set is actually going to be fungible to new efforts.
So I'm pleased to announce our next speaker is Sergey Arzoyan, who is a PhD candidate at the Laboratory of Environmental and Urban Economics at the EPFL in Switzerland. Sergey is going to be speaking to us today about energy efficiency improvement of large-scale retrofit in Swiss residential building stock. So Sergey, I will hand the floor over to you, and please feel free to start sharing your screen when you're ready.
So thank you very much, Robert, for your presentation. Now I will take the floor. So my name is Sergey Arzoyan, and currently I am a scientific collaborator in Laboratory of Environmental and Urban Economics, LORE, in EPFL. And this project is conducted in collaboration between EPFL and Swiss Federal Office of Energy. The title of the project is Endogenous Energy Efficiency Improvement of Large-Scale Retrofit in the Swiss Residential Building Stock. Nowadays, some people might have problems when living in old houses and apartments. Me personally, I used to live in this kind of apartment for a couple of years. And when at the end of the month I would get the bill with a multi-digit figure at the bottom of it, I was like, I was very surprised, and I didn't know what is it. Is it someone's phone number or is it my energy bill? Today, many people have a similar problem, especially people who live in Switzerland. So how can my presentation help to improve their life? I give a solution that can fundamentally change their life, your life, and life of many people on the planet in the long run by taking just better care of your apartment and being aware of energy consumption of your housing. So let's speak numbers. The Swiss people who we have right now, in this presentation, I have a question for you, and you will have a very fast poll to answer. How much energy consumption, in your opinion, in Switzerland is attributable solely to buildings? Please answer. Just give a shot fastly. Let's see. Voila. It's according to Swiss Federal Office of Energy, it's 50%, within which 6% is construction and maintenance of the building, 14% is electricity, and 30% is heating, air conditioning, and hot water. And we have others. So now I have a question for people from the US. What do you think? How much energy consumption in US is attributable solely to buildings? What its approximate number? Please give me your thoughts. 60%. Actually, it is less than in Switzerland. It's 40%, but we shouldn't forget about the size of the countries. Also, I have another question. What do you think? What are the most energy intense buildings in the world, especially and in the US? Actually, the energy intense buildings in US are the most energy intense in the world as well. What do you think? They are US schools, hospitals, factories, or universities? Exactly, they are hospitals. I was very also surprised when I saw this. Just to note also that 27% of energy consumption in US are attributable to cars, buses, and transportation, basically. So now I have a question for all of us. What do you think, how much energy consumption in the world is attributable solely to buildings? Right, it is about 40%. And approximately 30% of energy used in buildings are used inefficiently and unnecessarily, also just to note in the world. And a quarter of heating and cooling bill could be just going outside of the window, and 25% of air inside your home can escape through single glazed windows. So in our project, my project, we are using the Canton Energy Certificate of Buildings, COSB or GEAC in German. As you see, the G level, we call them energy labels. Energy label G is the worst, and energy label A is the best. So if we have a building and after retrofit, it can jump from, for example, from G to A to E, from G to A, or from D to C, or for example D to B, depending on the investment and the readiness of the people to invest money to make a retrofit. Depending on it, the energy label of the building can jump up. More you invest, higher it jumps. Also, one of the most interesting and very important research that we did, it's showing that we needed to allocate the construction periods per energy classes. So per energy classes that we just energy labels that we just spoke about, and we have this construction periods before 1919 and until 2020. As you see on the picture, on the figure, we have the buildings that were created in before 1919. They are very energy inefficient, and from 2001 we have until 2015-16 roughly, we have very energy efficient houses. As you see, between the years 1946 until 1980, we have energy inefficient buildings. This is mainly due to the fact that the in Switzerland, Swiss people might know that due to the big emigration after World War II in Switzerland, there was a high demand of new built houses, and the Swiss government decided to build many buildings that were not energy inefficient, not energy efficient. I'm sure many of you know what is this. This is the thermal image of the buildings. And I will show you how thermal energy picture changes before and after the energy retrofit. From the first, on the top, we have these old buildings that, and on the right, we have the thermal picture, the thermal image of it. We see that it has many rose and red colors, which shows that the energy escapes through the windows, roof, and door balconies. On the bottom photo, we have the same building but after renovation, and we see that after renovation we have this blue and green warm colors that shows that energy energy consumption and energy that is used in the building is not heating the environment anymore. So it shows clearly that after energy retrofit, you will need less energy to heat your house, because the energy that escapes from the building is less. Also, we conducted 7 scenarios. We have the baseline scenario, which I will speak about this more. We wanted, with these scenarios, we wanted to show which incentive is the best for people to make them to do retrofit in their houses. What will be in baseline scenario, we didn't change the current situation. For example, in information level scenario, we show that we have 4 main levels. In first level, the people are not aware of the possibilities to do retrofit, and the fourth level is the highest level when people are very enthusiastic, they want to do it, they are very eco-friendly, etc. And subsidy on retrofit, there are subsidies from the government. Tax on fossil energy, it's also tax on fossil energy that are introduced by the government. So the question, what do you think, which one of these scenarios, which case will have the biggest impact on decision of people to do retrofit and decrease the CO2 tax, CO2 emissions, excuse me. Very interesting results. Subsidy on retrofit won. Maybe I should have noted that subsidy on retrofit is not very high. It's around 1% per year. So actually, as you see on this picture, the best scenarios, they are combined scenarios, first and second, depends, they differ because of the CO2 tax. And actually, we don't take into account the combined scenarios that combine other scenarios together, 2 or 3 parameters. The best one is information level. If you see it, this orange color. I will show the results. So take-home messages that people can take after this presentation. In 2050, without any government policies, CO2 emission decreased by 67% if we compare to the current level. If we combine information level with subsidy and or CO2 tax, we can achieve a deep decarbonization pathway up to 96, 94 and 96%. We show that investment corporations and pension funds that own the houses typical household landlords do not implement retrofit because of the lack of economic incentive, and the refurbishment cost is too high. Also, increasing the information level doesn't significantly change the behavior of the investment corporations and pension funds, while it changes the behavior of household landlords, which results in decrease of CO2 emissions by 89% with respect to the current level. All this the CO2 tax decrease is comparing to 2015, and if we have 96% of CO2 decrease, it's in 2050. So just to conclude, I would like to say that my dream is to have a future when we will have a smart cities, green energy, smart energy, and smart mobility. And in order to achieve this, we have a long way to go. And energy refurbishment is one of the instruments that will help us to achieve these goals. Thank you very much for.
Thank you, Sergey. We have a couple of questions coming in. What kind of buildings or owners are you looking at in the study? Is it single family, collective housing, etc.?
So we took into when we I will show you one of the slides. When we took the survey from the cities of Genève, Lausanne, and Zurich, the cities Lausanne and Zurich provided us with the data on with the apartments, and so there was not difference between single family house and multi-family houses, but the apartments, the housing, the buildings that we took into account in Genève, they are very mixed. So they are single family houses. There are some offices that are located inside the buildings, etc. So it's in the case of Genève, it's more mixed. In the case of Lausanne and Zurich, they are mostly around 60%, 70%. They are multi-family houses. 30 to 40 they are single family houses.
Great, thank you. And is there any reason to believe that this simulation or these results would not be true for a different location, for example, in the US? Is it universally applicable?
What you mean in order to introduce this incentive to the people? in my opinion, it should be the main idea of the goal. The main idea of the project was to show how it can be used in Switzerland, of course, but since the variables are not very, there are not many variables that will change comparing to US and Switzerland. But the main thing I would say that I'm not sure how is it in US market, but in Switzerland, we have around 30% of people who are owner occupied. I mean, the owner occupied apartments. So in this, in US, the amount of these houses and apartments are much higher. So it will change, of course, depends on the, for example, I think in New York or in rural areas will be big difference, because I can imagine that in New York and these big megapolises, the people they own the apartments less than in more rural areas. So it's also very important, which called splint incentive actually. And when people, they have their own apartment, they are free to change whatever they want. If they want, they can make a refurbishment. And if you are renting a house or apartment, you have more difficulties and more constraints to make a refurbishment or reparation of your house. And if the landlord wants to do it, and he tells, I will do this reparation, but you should pay 50 francs or $50 more next month, the person who is right now in the house will tell, no, I don't want it. So there is this kind of problem.
And last but not least for this presentation block, I'm pleased to present Joe Babiec, or introduce him, who is the Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at VIA. And he's going to be talking about a collaboration that resulted from last year's Swiss-US Energy Innovation Days. So Joe, the floor is yours.
Great, so I'm Joe Babiec, Senior Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at VIA.
Hello, I'd also like to introduce myself. My name is Bowler. I'm a Senior Research Associate at Lucerne University of Applied Sciences, and I'll also be chipping in at a couple of points in the presentation with Joe.
So the next few minutes, what Ben and I would like to do is share with you the story of how SUEID actually catalyzed what has become a terrific partnership between our two organizations. VIA is a venture-backed company. For those who don't know us, our mission is to simplify the application of artificial intelligence, or AI, to energy data. We have offices in Somerville, Massachusetts, and Montreal, Quebec, to give our 25 employees the advantages of working in the unique clean energy and AI clusters, and with the research universities in both of those locations. You see on the right several of the leading energy companies, governments, and quasi-government organizations that VIA serves in the US, Europe, and globally.
And from my point of view today, I'm representing the Institute of Electrical Engineering within Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts. We undertake applied research activities that cover cyber-physical energy systems, physical energy systems, and also intelligent devices. And as a University of Applied Sciences, partnerships with industry are critical, which is why we've been really pleased to work very closely with VIA over the last 6 or 7 months. So just to say a little bit more about the sorts of areas where we're active in research and teaching. This slide shows our thematic areas. Within the Institute of Electrical Engineering, we focus on intelligent energy systems, smart and embedded systems, smart living, and autonomous systems and robotics. And it's in our work in intelligent energy systems which has been the focus of our relationship with VIA. In particular, relating to innovation in data access and the application of AI to solve energy sector problems. So I'll now hand back to Joe to say a little bit more on this.
Thanks, Ben. So this SUEID story begins 2 years ago with an important fact. 90% of the data in most energy companies goes unused, primarily because of the time and cost it takes to locate, permission, move, clean, format, and otherwise wrangle and prepare the data before an analyst can apply an AI model to it. And in 2018, I told the SUEID conference that VIA had developed a way to reduce the time, cost, and risks of data access and preparation by 50 to 80%, or in some cases, even more. VIA's solution is a software platform called the Trusted Analytics Chain, or TAC. TAC simplifies access to and analysis of static or real-time data from any authorized on-premise, cloud, or third-party data source. As you see portrayed here, TAC works the opposite way of any other solution. TAC brings an analyst query or algorithm from the analyst to where the data is located, runs analysis there, and only returns to the analyst answers authorized by the data owners. This is how TAC avoids the need to centralize data or create data lakes, and therefore how TAC delivers on the reductions in time and cost and risk that I mentioned. Very importantly, TAC also provides layers of functionality that ensure robust data privacy. Data owners get to set permissions or constraints on analysts before any analysis begins. TAC then records those permissions in blockchain-based smart contracts and enforces them throughout the analysis exercise. And if needed, advanced features like differential privacy and additive homomorphic encryption can ensure mathematically verifiable privacy protection. So that was 2018. And at SUEID 2019, I highlighted a common clean energy use case for TAC's unique capabilities. Grid operators globally are experiencing a rapidly rising number of grid infrastructure faults and failures that their historically effective AI models are not predicting. A key underlying cause, many of the grid assets, for example, transformers, are failing due to stresses for which they simply weren't designed. The stresses include the changing climate, but they also include the dynamics of utility scale clean energy itself, such as variable supply, dynamic loads, and two-way power flows. Most companies can't retrain their AI models on their own. They simply don't have enough volume and variety of these new types of faults and failures in their own experience. Combining data among multiple grid operators would overcome those limitations, but in practice, this is impractical because of privacy, security, competitive, and complexity issues. So TAC's unique architecture overcomes those barriers. And that's why 3 pioneering companies in the US and Asia established the Global Data Asset Collaborative, or GDAC. GDAC members use TAC to aggregate their data virtually and with strong privacy protections. Then each member is able to train their AI models, not just to catch up to the experiences the member has already had, but also to anticipate faults and failures that any member has experienced. And that's why since last year's SUEID, the number of GDAC members has grown to 4, with 12 more in the process of joining. That use case led Dr. Antonis Papamanuel of Lucerne University to start a conversation with me over barbecue and beer in San Antonio. We talked about how TAC might accelerate work by Lucerne University to support BFE, the Swiss Federal Office of Energy. We also talked about how VIA and Lucerne might collaborate on research that would advance the science of federated energy analysis, or the analysis of distributed energy data. Ben quickly joined the conversation, as have several of my VIA colleagues, and in early 2020, we submitted our first 2 joint program proposals to BFE. One program will develop and demonstrate new techniques for identifying stresses on the Swiss electric grid arising from the utility scale integration of clean energy technologies. The other will demonstrate that federated energy analysis can be formed right at the grid edge, for example, on smart meters themselves. Excitingly, not only BFE, but Swiss utilities and other Swiss energy companies are also partners in these programs. And based on that initial success, VIA and Lucerne have signed a formal collaboration agreement and identified additional opportunities to collaborate. Thanks to that agreement, we at VIA are starting to look at how we could establish a physical presence in Switzerland to support our partnership with Lucerne, and to allow our team to plug into the unique advantages of Switzerland's blockchain and clean energy clusters, and into the famously decentralized Swiss regulatory and cultural reality. So what started with introduction at SUEID 2018 and a casual chat at SUEID 2019 has led by 2020 to some great specific benefits for VIA, an important new research partner, much deeper grounding in the Swiss energy context, valuable introductions to companies and government organizations in the Swiss energy industry, and prominent opportunities to showcase and evolve VIA's core capabilities. So VIA, we're very optimistic this is going to lead to more common funding opportunities with Lucerne University, as well as adjacent commercial opportunities for VIA. Ben, please speak to your view and to Lucerne University's view of the partnership.
Thank you, Joe. And for us, well, working through the list, VIA's global outlook's been extremely valuable. And it's been very useful to bring the expertise of Joe and his colleagues into the research projects that are focused on Switzerland. But more than that, the value proposition that Joe's just described has actually created a really useful focal point for a number of projects. The federated approach itself has been an important asset in as we build consortia for research projects around the topics of data and advanced analytics. Then moving away from the purely technical, it's also been a relationship that's worked in spite of our geographical separation. And this has set a precedent that would encourage us to actively seek international collaboration with other potential partners. Another aspect has been more interpersonal. The relationship with VIA has quickly developed into one with trust and creativity, which means that we can experiment with ideas and push our applied research activity beyond where it might have been otherwise. As far as our ambition goes, we're hoping for success in our current joint funding applications. And also we continue to develop new tools and ideas with VIA that hopefully will support ongoing research and also teaching within the university. Overall, of course, our aim is to provide value to VIA as an important partner for Lucerne University of Applied Sciences.
Congratulations to you both. It's a fantastic partnership, and we're so happy to see that this came out of these events. And so hopefully you'll continue to work together and bring others on board. Is there any advice that you can give to organizations that are joining this year, although it's virtual, on how to form these sorts of partnerships or get the conversation started?
Maybe I'll give a thought first, and then Ben, you can pick it up from the HSLU side. So I think one lesson I personally had to learn was to be open to the serendipity of SUEID. I came to my first SUEID with the idea of trying to find people and start specific conversations, which was all helpful, but it turns out it was an unexpected conversation that led to this great partnership. I think the second thing is that there's such variety. It's a really open community though. So even though there are folks who may have areas of expertise adjacent to things that are core to what you might bring to the conference, what I found is it was a number of those side conversations that have led to not just this partnership, but some other interesting relationships that we've formed as a consequence. And the openness of the community is really high. That won't come across as well in the virtual space maybe, but it's always been my experience. So Ben, your thoughts on sort of how it's been to work with a company like us coming out of this sort of setting as opposed to maybe a traditional one that you might meet other companies?
I think it's important to, so you get to a certain level through the initial networking. I think what follows on from that, so you establish an area of common interest perhaps. I think what follows on from that is really important. And I think in the early parts of our relationships, we didn't really have a clear idea about where it might end up. But we spoke regularly and we brainstormed and we were open to lots of different ideas. And over time, then the relationship started to develop. So my advice would be to not think that you have to have the perfect answer at the outset, to reach out, to make contact with people, and then work with them, work with each other to understand the relative benefits, relative priorities of the different businesses and universities, if that's the partnership that you're looking for, and just to explore. And through that communication, I think you'll establish a way of working, and then opportunities will start to become apparent.
Thank you. That's such a perfect segue into the networking that I almost hate to disrupt it by asking another question, but I will because we have one from the audience. Roman Rudel asked, could you extend on the smart contracts? Could you speak a little more about those?
Sure. So smart contracts are really just if-then statements coded into software. And we designed our architecture around blockchain-based smart contracts so that we could have a mechanism that would be transparent for one or more owners of data and one or more analysts of data to be able to set the relevant constraints over who gets to see what data for how long, what they can do with it and what they can, and what kind of answers or levels of resolution or so forth are permissible upfront, in a way that even if the parties don't know each other, don't trust each other, may even be shielding some degree of identity from one another, there's still an immutable reference to look at beforehand and during the analysis, and then after the fact, something that compliance departments or regulators or even just the analysts and data owners themselves can refer back to if there are any questions about what was set up initially, how the exercise was undertaken, and then after the fact, what the results were. So that was a particular architecture choice. We didn't start with the idea that blockchain is cool, what can we do with blockchain? We instead set out with this idea of how do we solve this problem of data access for AI, and this turned out to be a pretty powerful piece of the solution.
I'm now looking forward to the second webinar session with 4 very interesting presentations. And the first speaker is Mr. Duane Jonlin, who is an energy code and energy conservation advisor for the city of Seattle. And he will talk about a subject that is central when it comes to energy efficiency in the building sector, and that is building labels, also known as energy codes. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Duane Jonlin, and please enjoy his presentation.
So, hello everybody. I know that you people on the Swiss side are proud of your mountains in Switzerland, but we want you to know that we have some nice little hills for hiking here too. Come on out. The big difference is that we don't have any place to get a cold beer and a hot meal in our mountains. You Swiss people have really figured out how to do civilization. Here in the US, we think of you Swiss as being really organized and hardworking, whereas our style is a little more chaotic. And the results are plain to see in this virus situation right now, with Switzerland returning to something close to normal later this week, while back here we're still stuck in this chaos and uncertainty. I'm sure you could teach us some lessons, but I have to warn you that we're not very good students here. I have to say one thing we have to recognize from this current unrest here in the US is that in both our countries, we have to use the opportunity of this energy transformation that we're doing to improve equity for those that our economy is leaving behind as the situation gets more severe. When I visited Switzerland a few years ago, another one of these trips, it wasn't actually clear to me whether your new buildings really did perform better than ours here in Seattle. So I spent, for this talk, some time comparing the two systems and found that the Swiss Energy Code shows off not only that famous Swiss engineering prowess, but also some real creativity. The comparison is tricky though, because we don't even measure the same things. American codes look at all the building energy from computers to coffee makers, while in Switzerland, you're focused on the heating and cooling and hot water. So what you might call a zero energy school in Neuchâtel might be a lot less impressive than a zero energy school here in New Jersey. We argue in the US about whether to measure just energy consumed at the site, or the energy burned back at the generating plant, or the energy cost, or perhaps the carbon emissions. And each one of those systems is used in various states around the US. But I won't hold you in suspense. Switzerland wins. Their regulations demand excellent building energy performance from the building envelope, the walls and windows and roof. And the allowable energy for room heating and water heating is strictly limited, while the technology to achieve it is more or less open. Extensive renewables are required in fossil fuel or electric resistance heating is discouraged in the code. And that combination of mechanical and water heating energy use with rooftop solar panels is required to result in almost zero net energy. I should say parenthetically that I love that since it's Switzerland, the code has special exemptions for ski lifts and mountain hikes. And the Swiss have also put their existing buildings and houses on a ticking clock, so that sometime in the next 15 years, everyone's heating systems have to get upgraded. I have no doubt that when I visit 15 years from now, Swiss buildings will be emitting no carbon at all, and they'll be just as light and comfortable as they are today. Now, this is not to say that we don't have anything going on back here. I spent the last year developing this next version of the Seattle Energy Code, and we're operating on 4 basic principles to move us towards carbon neutrality. And I'm going to spend a few minutes on this slide because this is critical. The first principle is that the envelope is forever. So the building envelopes we're building today will likely remain for 100 years, and they're very difficult and expensive to upgrade. So we have to start building them right today. The Swiss insulation standard for envelopes is great, but I would suggest that you might want to get serious about testing the building air leakage like we do. A thick down parquet is not very useful if it's full of holes. You'd be surprised when you actually do test your buildings that you think are extremely well sealed, how many holes there are. That second one is no internal combustion buildings now. We can't possibly get to carbon neutral in 2050 or 2030 if we're still installing oil and gas heating in 2020. It just does not work that way. I think Switzerland could also make this same proclamation to say no more. And I'd say even those wood pellet stoves that you're big on are not smart in the long run when you could be burning those pellets back at a central plant and using that electricity to run heat pumps instead. And besides, burning any kind of fuel indoors creates health and safety problems. And for that matter, burning stuff inside buildings to keep warm is just generally caveman technology. We're both ready to move past that into the future. Number 3 is efficient use of electricity. I should say extremely efficient use of electricity. Both Switzerland and my part of the US have a lot of hydropower, but we're going to need that clean electricity to run vehicles and heat buildings when we take away the fossil fuels. So careful control of lighting and plug loads is essential. Switzerland's doing a great job on many of these issues, but plug load controls might be your new frontier. Call me up or touch me in one of these chats and we can talk about that. And finally, renewable energy and energy storage. We need to integrate solar panels and energy storage to the extent feasible. As an architect, I'm hoping that it doesn't have to be ugly. This is another place where Switzerland, due to its great history of design, might actually come up with some really beautiful solar buildings. Switzerland's jumped out ahead of the US in this, which maybe makes sense given the high cost of electricity there. And they require an impressive 10 watts of solar per square meter of floor space. That's 1 watt per square foot, which is 4 times the ASHRAE requirement. In that little box, it says there's advantages to multiple codes. Our chaotic situation where we have 2 national standards competing and several versions of each one in use and many other codes as well, allows good ideas to germinate somewhere, maybe in LA, Seattle, New York, and filter up into the federal level. A model for both our codes might just be the humble refrigerator. The refrigerator uses a heat pump to extract the heat out of the cold interior of the fridge. You think there's no heat in there, but there's heat. You take that heat out and dump it into your kitchen. But we can turn that heat pump around to extract the heat from the cold mountain air and deliver it inside the building. Refrigerators are really well insulated and tightly sealed like our buildings should be, but we need fresh air too. So I've just added a heat recovery ventilator there, like you see. I think Switzerland codes require 80% efficient HRVs, and providing lots of good fresh air, but not wasting energy. And then of course we pop in some windows and some lights. And now we're ready to just add solar panels on the top, and we made it, right? All that technology to reduce the energy use also shrinks the size of the solar array that we need, so it really does fit on the roof. And a nice dog to keep us company. That's good to stay warm in the winter, is to have a dog. And the whole point of this analogy is that none of this is technically difficult. It's not rocket science. It's about a cultural shift for our design and construction industry, really. Remember my motto, that which exists must be possible. So solar panels on the roof are great on a summer day with the furnace off and the sun shining, right? It's a little trickier on a cold, dark winter day. So battery storage and overnight heat storage might make some of that daytime energy last a little longer. Switzerland's similar to my corner of the US, where we have substantial hydro and wind generation, and these do fine in winter. And I especially like, for this purpose, ground source heat pumps, which allow you to store some of that excess summer heat deep underground to reuse in winter. Maybe boost it in the summer months with a small rooftop solar water heater to warm the ground back up. Switzerland is supposed to complete work soon on MOPEC 2020, their energy standard. I'm looking forward to seeing how that shakes out. And I have to complete work this month on the new Seattle code. And we're all so busy that we might forget to look around us now and then to see if somebody else has already solved the very problems we're working on in other countries or cities. It's that classic problem of not seeing the forest for the trees. Perhaps if we were to read energy codes from a dozen cities around the world and extract the best ideas from each one, we'd find that all the questions we're working on right now have been answered, perhaps. All it takes is a few hours with Google Translate or a meeting like the one we're in right now. So please let me know if you'd like to bounce some ideas around. I'd love to work with you experts on both sides of the ocean and learn from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Duane. Those are some nice pictures to end your presentation. We already have a question in the Q&A chat. So how difficult is it politically to introduce better energy codes?
That is an interesting question. The reason that I'm able to go this far in Seattle is because I have a city government and a state government that are both committed to moving this forward. And most parts of the US are not so fortunate. I believe there's a similar situation in Switzerland where the cantons with the larger urban centers are enthusiastically moving forward, and others are more rural areas are holding back. So you're never going to be well liked by imposing new regulations on people who just want to get things built. And all we can do is to find ways to lessen any negative impacts and make it more simple and more profitable for people to move forward. Sorry if that's a mealy-mouthed answer, but it's hard politically.
Thank you. Do you know how widespread building labels are in the US? I mean, do you happen to know the percentage of buildings, or I mean, in Seattle, that are certified?
Building labels in the US are almost unheard of. I think New York City is doing something, but we have not gone there, and we're using the energy regulations for construction to make this happen. But you're very unlikely to find a sticker on someone's window that shows how energy efficient they are.
Okay. So there's another question. Does the rule around no internal combustion buildings preclude the use of fuel cell technology? And if so, is this sensible?
I would not be opposed to fuel cell technology. However, and this is an architect talking about engineering principles, so don't laugh. But my understanding is that fuel cell technology is extremely inefficient. So I think that the use of that might be better put to use in vehicles than in standing buildings, which can handle larger equipment. I think heat pumps, heat storage systems are all going to get us much further than fuel cells.
Okay. There's another question.
Feel free to argue with me about that later. Maybe I'll learn something.
Exactly, yeah. And then in the light of the environmental cost of battery energy storage, does Seattle see interests in mountain-based pumped hydro energy storage?
So far, since we have a pretty reliable supply of hydro, we have not undertaken to use pumped hydro. However, I could see that as more renewables come on the grid here, that might start to make more economic sense. Right now, we can still use pretty much all the energy we generate all the time, and if we don't need some of our hydropower, we can just have less going over the dam at that moment. So we can manage it that way. But I would say that in the not too distant future, that might start making sense. It's already done in Texas and a couple other places in the US.
I think, or I suggest that we move on to the next presentation, which is held by Silvia Domingo-Irigoyen. Silvia is a scientific researcher at the Institute of Building Technology and Energy at the Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts. And today she's going to talk about indoor thermal comfort in Swiss residential buildings in a warming climate. So without further ado, please enjoy the following presentation by Silvia.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So as Diego said, I am a researcher in the Institute of Building Technology and Energy of the Lucerne University of Applied Science and Arts. And what I would like to show today, it is a part of the results of a project that is called Air Conditioners in the Context of Climate Change, that has been financed by the Swiss Federal Office of Energy with contribution of the City of Zurich and the Lucerne University of Applied Science and Arts. The goal of this project is to determine how the CO2 balance of mobile air conditioners can be improved in residential buildings, and additionally assess whether legislation on active cooling in the residential sector is still up to date considering the climate change. So as an introduction, we already have enough evidence that our climate is warming. So in the left image, we can see the annual temperature in Switzerland in the last 150 years. So most of the 20 years, it has been much warmer than the average of the period 60-90, and the increase in temperature from the middle of the 19th century, it is 2 degrees. Additionally, we have other parameters that have been measured. For example, we have 10% of more rainfall, there is 60% of volume capacity in our glaciers, and so on. The National Center for Climate Services has published in 2018 the Swiss climate scenarios, where it is shown how the climate change is going to impact Switzerland. So here we see some of the data related to the year 2060, when we consider the evolution of climate change without really strong measures to mitigate it. So as we see, we are going to have drier summers with up to 4.5 degrees hotter temperature. We are going to have more heavy precipitation, both in winter and summer, but overall in winter we are going to have much less snow, and in summer we are going to have longer heat waves and up to 17 days per year of hot days in comparison with one that is nowadays. As a consequence, the Swiss citizens are becoming much more used to buy air conditioners, this type of mobile air conditioners. So last year, they were sold 50% more than in previous year. And almost 90% of these units were sold in the first half of the year as a consequence of 2 really early heat waves in June. So considering this, or keeping this in mind, in our project, we want to evaluate what is the cooling energy consumption and comfort in a dwelling, considering different types of air conditioning, including also a photovoltaic system and an electric battery, and then under different conditions of use, mostly changing the set point temperature for cooling, and under different climate conditions, considering the current climate, but also for a future projection. That climate is based on the Swiss scenarios of 2011 we are simulating in the city of Basel, and considering the emission scenario A1B, that is a medium average climate development. So here in this image, we can see the dwelling that we are simulating. It has 3 bedrooms and 1 living room in the corner that has a loggia. So as a starting point, I would like to show you some images related to comfort. So each of these graphs has in green points the operative temperature, so it's the temperature that we feel. In the vertical axis and in the horizontal axis is the average of the exterior temperature during 48 hours. So we compare the interior temperature with the exterior hours during the last 2 days. In the graph, we see also some lines that that sets the comfort range according to the SIA norms. This is based also in international regulations. So the blue line, it is the upper limit for comfort, considering active cooling or mechanical ventilation. And the orange line, dot line, it is the lower upper limit with natural ventilation. In any case, in our study, we are going to consider the blue line as the limit. So all the time that we are over that line is going to be considered as overheating time. So in summer, the temperature is 26.5 degrees. That will be around 80 Fahrenheit degrees. So in the first, in the left top image, we see the temperature in a living room in a mean year nowadays. So all the points that are over the blue line, as I said, are overheating hours, and the opposite extreme. So in the lower right image, we see what it will happen in a future within a warm year. So we will have many hours of overheating. These are the temperatures during the whole summer, and if we consider only the hours where the building is occupied, it doesn't look like so extreme. So for example, in the mean year, we will have around 40 overheating hours, but they will become 400 in a warm future year. So in our study, we are considering 2 types of air conditioners. The first of them is the mobile air conditioners. So these are these compact units that are located inside the room and are connected to the exterior through a canal, normally through the windows. They are pretty inefficient. They only work full load, and that means that they are not only inefficient, but also lead to discomfort. These systems also produce heat directly in the room, and they are pretty noisy. For the simulations, we are considering an energy efficiency ratio of 2.6, and we are comparing them with the type of multi and single split air conditioners. They are much more efficient. They have an inverter system, so they can work at partial load. Most of them are also reversible, so working also for heating. And they are 2 units. One is located at the exterior, and the other is located in the interior. And there could be more one of interior unit. In this case, we are going to select a class A++ with a seasonal energy efficiency of 6.5. The labels of both of them are not directly comparable, but yeah, the split systems are much more efficient. So we are going to simulate 5 scenarios. The worst case scenario is with the mobile unit with a temperature of 22 degrees. Set point temperature, we are going to cool both the living room and the bedroom during the day hours and the bedroom during the night. The reference scenario is the same, but with a higher set point temperature, 25.5, that we are under, we are in the range of comfort. And then we have 3 scenarios with a split system. The first of them is the same as the reference scenario, but with a split system. And then 2 where we are only cooling partially the building, once for the living room and other for the bedroom. So the results shows that the cooling demand with the mobile air conditioners is pretty high when we consider a set point temperature of 22 degrees up to 17 kilowatts hour per square meter per year in a reference year, and this could double when we consider a future warmer year. only by changing the set point temperature to 25.5, we can reduce the cooling demand between 60 and 90%. And cooling partially in the building also reduce additionally the cooling demand between 40 and 60%. In cooling consumption, when we compare the worst case scenario with the scenario one with a mobile with a split system, we can reduce the consumption between 80 and 90%. And then when we cool partially the building, we get really low energy consumption values, but we have to remember that we will get overheating overall in the future climate. So here is a bit more detailed image of the energy consumption. So this is the case of a mobile system. The red line is the energy consumption of the system itself. And as we can see, it's pretty high. So the system only works full load. And also in order to reach the set point is switching on and off continuously. We were combining this system with a photovoltaic system, dimensioned with the 10 watts per square meter of heating area that Muken recommends. And with these conditions, we get only 10% of self-consumption. So the photovoltaic system is only able to cover 10% of the cooling demand. Adding a small battery improves a bit, but not really much. And making a bigger installation with 30 watts per square meter, we reach almost 30% of self-consumption for cooling. When we compare with the case of a split system, we see that here the power of the system is much lower. We see the energy produced by the photovoltaic, and the blue fraction, it is the fraction of the cooling demand or the cooling consumption that is covered directly by the photovoltaic, and the green should come from the network. So in this case, the self-consumption for cooling is approximately 30%, and when it's combined with a bigger battery, it could be reaching 60%. A bigger battery will be possible, but it won't be reasonable. So this is only part of the results from this project, and as a really generic conclusions, I would like to say that when selecting energy and efficient cooling, we should go in any case for a split or multi-split system, but also considering an appropriate use of the cooling. So this means setting up relative high comfort temperatures. The direct consumption of electricity from the photovoltaics, it makes sense because the production of electricity is maximal when the cooling demand is required. But an electrical battery, it only makes sense if it is used for other uses, such as electromobility or heating. I would like also to remember, in any case, the installation of a cooling system leads always to energy consumption from the net. So we should prioritize passive measures or look in other systems such as free cooling to avoid additional energy consumption. So if you have any questions, now is the time.
Great, thank you very much, Silvia. Those were very interesting insights in your project. There's a question regarding the occupation of the building. So are you not forgetting that in the future, the residential buildings will be occupied throughout the whole day due to more working from home?
Yeah, so there are additional simulations to evaluate different parameters. So for example, if we consider that also the bedrooms are cool the whole day, the energy consumption won't be so high because partially through the with the cooling load in the living room, we are cooling partially already the bedrooms. So the increase is not is not too big. But yet we have also simulated such as scenarios where all the day is possible cooling. It also makes sense because the electricity is available during the day, not during the night. So one possibility is to cool the building during the day and to avoid to have to cool during the night and take the energy from the grid. So this is also a good point to cool during the day. But yeah, in that case, the building has to be better a massive building that could be cooled down during the day.
Great, thank you. I have also a short question. Could you say something regarding the costs or the cost difference between the mobile AC units and the multi-split units? Or do you happen to know like a rough estimate regarding the costs?
Yes, so from the mobile units, there are some that are pretty cheap. That could be both in the big wholesalers, and they are could be up to 200 francs, but more or less efficient one could be 800 francs. And then a single split will run more 3,000 or so. And the point is also the mobile you can install directly from for the split unit. You need to install part on the facade, so you need a building permit, and you have also to do probably a perforation to connect interior and exterior unit and so on. So it's not so easily to do.
Since there are no more questions and we're also a bit short on time, I suggest that we move on to the next presentation, which is held by Jörg Worlitschek, who is the head of the Competence Center for Thermal Energy Storage at the Lucerne University of Applied Science and Arts. So yeah, good transition. We stay at the same university. And he's going to talk about new forms of heat storage, key components for flexible sector coupling. So without further ado, please enjoy the following presentation by Jörg Worlitschek.
Thank you, Diego, for the nice introduction. And thank you to the two pre-speakers, which really gave the perfect intro into the talk. And as well, warm regards from my side from Lucerne here. So I'm referring a bit to what other speakers said today already. We all should be aware that 50% of the energy consumption worldwide that is used for heating and cooling. And this is the same is true for Switzerland. And if we look at the residential sector, for example, which has been in focus in the previous talks, it's even more, it's 80%. And Duane, you were talking so positively about Switzerland. Well, one has to admit that 80% of this energy in the residential sector is still based on fossil. So considering the heating and cooling, there is still a long way to go to make this transition work. So, and Silvia, you wonderfully pointed out as well that well, the climate change has an effect on that, of course. And I would say we in Switzerland go in the direction of the US as it is today, where both heating and cooling play a huge role. If you look at our simulations where we, based on the climate scenarios, on the different climate scenarios, look at heating and cooling demand in the future, so going up to 2100, that's as long as the climate scenarios are calculated currently. When you look at that, then you see that in a realistic case, the heating demand decreases by 40% and the cooling demand increases by 1,200% within this, by the end of the century. So looking at typical buildings from today, which are made for the next 50 years, one has to say, well, if you build a building now, then better look at these kind of numbers, because that might already change a lot. And what it brings as well is that it has a huge chance for thermal energy storage in it as well, because as soon as you have a balanced use of heating and cooling, you can play much more with it, a bit like Duane, you pointed out before. Well, these kind of data go into energy system models for Switzerland. The first speaker, you have wonderfully shown what you do in the US, and in Switzerland we have different kind of energy system models where we look at sector coupling and at all the possibilities, how we can work with then mainly photovoltaics in Switzerland, which are possible. Wind only plays a smaller role. And when you look here again on the heat then which we want to supply, then of course this highly interacts with electricity based on heat pump technology. This interacts of course with direct sources of heat, and this interacts of course with combined heat and power plants. So this is where this comes into play, and all these simulations basically from different perspectives show that thermal storage is one of the very strong pillars in this play to have at the end not only sector coupling but to have flexible sector coupling. So that's the way how the International Energy Agency calls that now, flexible sector coupling, so to allow for shifting different needs in the different sectors. So in this talk, I would like to focus on new ideas, on a few spotlights of new possibilities and new ideas for this pillar within the overall energy transition and the whole energy framework. So this storage, like all storages, of course, have always different time scales, different frequency that they consider. Looking at thermal storages, one can have the range from minutes to daily up to seasonal, where there is for sure then a high competitive advantage then as well with looking at other possibilities. And I would like to go now in examples in each of those. So let's start with the minute side. So if you look at the minutes, then it's, for example, about secondary control energy. And there's a company which is called TECO. This is a spin-off of Swisscom telecommunication company, and they run a virtual power plant. So this means they switch heat pumps in about 8,000 to 10,000 households in Switzerland, and with that they provide control, secondary control energy to Swissgrid. And of course, you can imagine that when you want to switch these 8,000 instances, then you should know something about the thermal behavior of the houses which are in the background, and you should be able to care with the data. So what we do is we use very fast thermal energy system models on the one hand, and on the other hand, we care about big data science possibilities. And by combining these two, we can run these kind of virtual power plants then in a much more robust manner. And additional to that, one could find many, many additional possibilities what to do with this kind of data. So just to get an imagination, you have 8,000 houses. You have every 2 seconds a signal of the power time series. And with that, you can learn quite even more than just the energy part of that. Then when we look at the daily challenge, Duane, you had mentioned as well this direction already. I mean, we in Switzerland will be mainly based on PV. And then when you look at heating demand of houses, then this will be in the future typically be combined with heat pumps as well, going to the cold and the hot side then. And then you have to match supply and demand. And this is why stationary batteries at the moment are increasing and increasing in growth. And of course, one can think there as well on the thermal side. And based on our material science research and based on our component system models, we could find solutions here to increase the storage capacity by up to a factor of 5, comparing it to a typical water storage today. And out of that, there is now a new spin-off company being created from our institution, which is called COVA, Cold and Warm. And this COVA provides energy capsules with energy storage material inside. And when having these kind of capsules in a typical water storage, then one has a capacity increase of that water storage by a factor of 5. If you look at a bigger scale, then you have a system which is called electrothermal energy storage. And currently in the US, Google is looking at this concept a lot. In Germany, the Aerospace Center is looking at that a lot. And in Switzerland, there is the company MAN, which is looking at that. Basically, it's a heat pump, a huge heat pump based on CO2 and connected with hot and cold storages. And there you have wonderful possibilities to provide flexible heat and cold on the one hand, and you can, in certain instances and under certain conditions, re-electrify as well if you need electricity. And then as a last point on the seasonal side, of course, there are many, many different possibilities of bringing seasonal thermal energy storages. In Switzerland, we see that, well, of course, the best are huge installations like there are in Denmark already, many and so on. Nevertheless, well, it will always be easier to install them on a more local and a smaller level. Normally, they get very expensive then. So one approach that we have is to have new insulation materials and water vapor barriers where one can have in volumes that are available, like bunkers, like cellars, like available room, one can build now based on water thermal seasonal storages. And this is as well about material research. And one can see here a first demo installation of such a changed room into a seasonal storage. And one can now store heat from summer into the winter with this kind of installation. So I hope I could show you in the last 10 minutes that thermal energy storage is a very important pillar within the overall energy transition, and that there are research points and developments ongoing which improve the possibilities by far here in this sector. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Jörg. Thank you for your insights. There don't seem to be any questions. So in that case, I have a short question. You talked about this startup, Kova. Do you know if they're already commercializing their product, or are they still in like an early stage?
Well, they plan to commercialize so they plan to have first pilots in the next year in 2021. And then in about a year later, they plan to go on the market. And in fact, they are planning as well to start first talks with the US for preparing for a market entry as well in the US.
Okay, great to hear. I'm excited about that product. Now we have another question. Do you think that the sector coupling topic has already entered the common knowledge of politics and people? It seems that everyone is only interested in electricity, like the first talk by Rob.
Yes, I agree. So we feel that whenever it comes about the energy discussion, then it's very often an electricity discussion, and one is not aware that most of the public is not aware that this is just 1/3 of the story, and we keep on recommunicating and talking about that. But I completely agree that there is still a long way to go. I mentioned this International Energy Agency task where we are part of as well in this area, and the goal there is basically the only one is to find the right communication pathways to bring this message along.
Great, thank you. So now we have a couple of more questions. So is a tank type seasonal thermal energy storage system more economical than drilled ground coupled heat pump?
Well, I mean, at the end, it's always a mix of different things, no? If you have a drilled heat pump and if you have, let's say, a set of drillings, then you can use that already like an active storage, no? And the more we drill, the more we will need to run them like storages, because we have they will influence each other and so on. So then you have already as well one type of seasonal thermal energy storage, no, by combining these drillings. These are not possible everywhere. That's not that doesn't work everywhere. And in fact, then depending on the situation, different technologies might make sense. It's really worth looking, for example, at Denmark. They have like thermal lakes where they store in these lakes then the heat of the summer and for whole communities, and they bring that back. Austria is currently starting as well big projects in these directions, like in Graz and in Vienna. So there are wonderful possibilities, not just with probes, but with other instances. But of course, one always has to look at the overall story. What plays as well a role is if there is a lake around, for example, like us in Lucerne. No, there's now a lot ongoing on taking heat from the lake, which by itself is of course a huge storage of energy, and where then of course you do not need these kind of concepts.
Yeah, thanks. I totally agree. So there are more questions, but since we're a bit short of time, I suggest that we move on, and for the people that still have questions and like them to ask to Jörg, please join the Remo networking session after the next presentation, and you can join Jörg at the table and ask him the questions there.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks again, Jörg, for the presentation. So let's move on to the next and final presentation of this webinar session. The second webinar session, there's a third one. The next presentation is held by Lawrence Fulton, who is an associate professor at Texas State University, and he's going to talk about a publicly available cost simulation of sustainable construction options for residential buildings. So without further ado, please enjoy the following presentation by Mr. Lawrence Fulton.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that, Diego. Just as an advisory, I do not speak English, I speak Texan. So if I need to repeat something, just let me know. Okay. I do speak a little German, but no English whatsoever. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let me just tell you a little bit about why this is near and dear to my heart. About 10 years ago, my wife and I retired once, and then we were about to get into academia. And so we set upon building a house that was green for the environment and green for the pocketbook. We wanted to see what elements worked and what elements didn't, and I wanted to incorporate that in part of my research. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is what I've been living and what I've been doing research on for the last approximately a decade. All right, the easiest way to get this started is with a picture. Oops, back up. I'm going to show you, I've mentioned my motivation. Let me minimize this so I can see you guys. And I'm going to start from the lower right-hand side. When we set about building this property, we wanted to use the technologies at the time that were intelligent, number one, and number two, we wanted to use sustainable construction techniques throughout. So we had both LEED and National Association of Home Builders and all sorts of advisories on how to get this done. And the biggest part that we had to do was plan. So all these things I'm going to talk about were planned up front, but I will talk about them because they're important considerations for any sort of construction. Not all of these options would be right for anybody, and there was a lot of simulation and math that went behind before we made decisions. I'll talk about some of that today, and I'll show you the publicly available simulation that's out there for people. But starting on the lower right-hand side, one of the first things we had to do was set up the construction bins, recycle bins. We minimized the damage to the environment, and then everything that we had was sent to recycle that was possibly recycled. That's in the lower right-hand corner. We pulled in stone from local areas. Limestone is prevalent here, and we used that because it reduced transportation costs, reduced all sorts of costs of production as well. Engineered lumber. One of the things that's you've probably seen before, but this is a finger jointed studs. This engineered lumber we used because we were able to use recycled elements for the construction piece. Isonine foam, that's just one of many options we could have used, but we used isonine because it provides a really good thermal barrier, and as we learned earlier, a lot of our heat escape is due to our building structures. So. We had the discussion of mini splits just a few seconds ago, and we had mini splits installed in some places, and we also had geothermal, which I'll get to in a minute, installed. The mini splits are very efficient because we can turn them off, and we can control them and have them going when we want to. One of the best features of the property is the Pioneer water tank / water system. So I live 100% off rainwater harvesting. 100% of my water comes from rainwater. We capture off the roofs, we purify on site, we store in a very large tank, which isn't feasible for some places, although underground tanks are available. It's important to note that the point source solution for water reduces energy consumption. There's the energy-water relationship, which I think most people are familiar with. In California, for example, 17% of their cost of energy is associated with the movement and processing of water. Okay. Texas relies on aquifers, and we are, as you might imagine, prone to drought. We're in a semi-arid region. So having a system that's capable of sustaining us means pretty good engineering, and a lot of simulation was done right up front. And that's hence the 40,000-gallon tank. Obviously, the pumping system is important because if I run out of water, my wife would kill me. Okay, so that's why we have dual water pumps. Purification on site. This has gone through a process. Again, it's a research house. So aside from the water arriving and being processed through filters, basket filters and sock filters, the tank itself turns, and so the water stays active in the tank. But when the on-demand pumps come on to push water into the house for demand, the water is filtered through essentially a 50-micron filter into a charcoal regeneration system, which is quite good at making the water taste great, and then obviously into a UV system for purification to kill 99.997% of the biologics. Mini splits. I've got two sets here because one of them was the type that you put in the side. They have them that you put in the roof as well. So anytime we could take the stress off of our geothermal, which I'll talk about in a minute, we put in mini splits. Obviously, Energy Star throughout. There is a little cost structure, but it pays for itself in just a few years, and that analysis is in our paper, which you can take a look at. I'll give you some links. We use the aerobic septic system because we're out in the country. We're kind of, I would call it semi-rural. We're not rural, but we are out in the country, and so aerobic septic systems are responsible for processing of black water. The geothermal field. Now, this is an interesting one. We had 4 200-foot wells drilled into the ground, 4 200-foot wells, so we could do the heat exchange and use geothermal exchange. And the problem we had with that here in Texas is even though the temperature of the ground is stable, we were not getting the heat exchange we needed. We just weren't. So this was not a success. I'll tell you what was a success and what wasn't. Center to our build was kilowatt systems. I have 17.5 kilowatt system. I actually had to get a waiver to put that size of system on this house. It's a fairly large house. That system, though, powers everything, including at one point I had a Nissan Leaf, early adopter. I ran that Nissan Leaf for about 3 years, back and forth to work. I literally had no electric bill, no gas bill. Well, I did have an electric bill because I was grid tied, but it was break even essentially because I would bank money from the days and consume it at night. So there's some gray consumption here of electricity you have to be advised. Once the power walls or the storage systems improve, and we're not talking lead acid batteries here, once they improve to a point, this system will take me completely out of the grid tied phase. At any rate, the Nissan Leaf was powered, so legitimately everything that was electric, the more that electric, the better, because if everything's powered by electricity, then the only damage to the environment besides the construction process for the panels and everything else is the gray consumption, which is where I consume at night the electricity, and that still has an effect on the environment. We've gone to tankless water heaters, considered solar. Tankless water heaters with the electric system we have are quite efficient because they're powered by, yes, solar power. So there is no constant consumption further because they are on-demand systems. Then we don't have to worry about constantly heating water from a traditional water heater. So they're only used when you need it. And that's pretty common over in Europe. It's less common here. And then finally, I'll just mention that we did install a propane, couldn't get natural gas, but propane-based backup generator system so that we're ready for the zombie apocalypse. That was just fun. That said, so this is kind of the reasons why we were interested in doing a simulation, because in the United States, and it's somewhat that way in Europe, but not nearly as well that way, I would argue that Europeans have a tendency to do the right thing first before worrying about the pocketbook as much. Having lived in Europe for a while, it seemed like it was much more common, at least. Green for the environment and green for the pocketbook were the two things that we needed to establish. Because if there's no break even for the US consumer, there's no incentive. And there's no incentive for the builders to build if there's no incentive for the consumer. Things like policies like what California's put in place, which requires an offset for solar, make a difference for sure. But outside of California, where you don't have those policies, then the cheaper the better that meets the demand for the consumer. All right. Wind isn't considered here, although it will be added to the simulation. Why the wind map here and the efficiency of local turbine systems are just not there. We're located, you can see the mouse right there, right in this section of Texas, where the wind does not produce sufficient amounts of energy for consideration. Eventually, we'll include it in the simulation. But again, once again, we had to have a reasonable break even. This is just an example spreadsheet to show that the type of analysis you really need to provide consumers to make them have an incentive to do any of these things. And oh, by the way, not all of these things are available at all areas. In some places in the United States, it's illegal to capture rainwater. So you have to consider policies, you have to consider affordability, et cetera. Median ownership time for the US for houses is about 13.3 years. So that took us to, before I go too much further, let me hit the, that took us to some analysis we've been doing. The last one is a publicly available cost simulation. This is out on the web. You're welcome to it. It's available from the sustainability piece. It is really a rough draft, if you will, of allowing people to get a sense of the cost and the environmental considerations of building sustainably. Everybody's experience is different. The math behind the simulation, I'm not going to walk you through it. You can read it here. Every simulation has to have a flow chart. We have a flow chart that discusses every value that we've used in this simulation comes from somewhere, from some resource, etc. Efficiencies and everything else are built in. I don't have time to talk about those. You can look at those later. So I've been doing this for a while, living this way for a while, and so I thought it would be interesting, and I'll go right to the simulation, interesting to provide a mechanism for people to evaluate different constructions. Okay, I'll reload the simulation here. There we go. All right, so this is the website where the simulation's hosted. It's an R-Shiny app. It's a very, very easy way to do fairly quick simulations. On the left-hand side, we have baseline construction that people might consider. On the right-hand side is comparison construction. The real meat is under the hood, where we've done all the math. for the United States, I might add. A lot of the cost structures would have to be reconsidered for Europe, and not hard to do, but would have to be reconsidered, and some of the other components. So what happens, just so you can get oriented, right now we have a break-even map down here in the middle, which shows we're comparing apples to apples. Literally, it's the same construction piece. The only deviations you'll have is due to the simulation runs. They're done automatically. And you can see down here where we have the energy environmental component. What we're monitoring is cumulative megawatt hour consumption, kilogram CO2, water and wastewater costs, water required to meet demand, water heat costs by year and acquisition, and we assume replacements based upon the standard life cycles and some distributions of those for whether if you have a standard water heater or whatever. And so you can see we're tracking essentially the environmental effect as well as the cost effects. We recognize that some people may want to do the environmental, won't want to be environmentally conscious, but they need to find out that there's some sort of return on investment. So let's go back up here and let's select some things here. We'll do geothermal. I'll do electric tankless water heater. Engineered lumber, by the way, the cost for engineered lumber is equivalent, roughly equivalent to that of traditional lumber. Ice-beam foam acquisition is more expensive. However, you do not need venting systems and some certain exchange systems. So you have to balance that in the fact. We'll do an electric vehicle. Obviously, Energy Star, because you get a good return on the bang for the buck. Low water fixtures. Year zone is controlled by the master one here, but it'll be 30. That's for my life cycle at least. I'm going to get 100% via solar. That adjusts also the solar acquisition requirements based upon the location. 3,000 square foot house, 26 windows, 3 external doors. We'll go with water source. Let's run off rainwater. We'll run the water, we'll use an anaerobic system, which is much more expensive and much more costly than traditional systems, but it's also environmentally friendly. On average, let's say just 2 occupants, that's fine. Water cistern size in 100 gallons will go 40,000. 2 water heaters. Average acquisition costs. Now, some of these I have already the values for them, but these can change, so they're made flexible. And there is a value of 20 trees per 1,000 square feet used in construction. However, that can change if you have wood intensive or less wood intensive pieces. Tax credit. This is an interesting one because tax credit absolutely affects the break-even point, and it's something that has to be considered. Geothermal and solar right now in the United States have tax credits associated with them. What state are we going to build in? Obviously, that's going to have a difference too. So I'll say Texas because that's where I'm from. Keep pumping size and all the way down. I'm not gonna focus too much on this. There are some other parameters you can set, but the bottom line up front is it runs a simulation for you based upon those and the underlying distributions, and provides kind of an estimated break even, as well as a difference in cumulative kilograms of CO2 equivalent, water, etc. So that the individuals get an idea of what they're doing with the environment and how they're affecting the environment, as well as how they're doing in terms of break even. When you slide, if we take away, let's take away the tax credit. Okay, we're taking away the tax credit now. The break even slides to 23 years. The thing about the tax credit is I'll put it back at 30. Not just the tax credit. This is with 21 years is break even. That's pretty late, considering that the median home ownership is 13.3. So you have to start thinking, well, rainwater may not even be legal. Let's go with city water, which is your cheapest bet, except for the effects on the electricity of the environment. And that drops you to 17 years break even. This is a US-centric simulation, but it is a simulation that provides individuals some idea of what the cost structure would be based upon their decisions and what the effects on the environment would be as well. Okay, that's all I have. What questions do you have?
Great, thank you very much, Lawrence. I'm looking forward to check out your tool and play around with it. So we have a couple of questions. The first one is regarding your first slide. why does it seem that roofs are always only covered by a standard size 15 or 17.5 kilowatt PV system? First, it looks ugly. An integrated whole roof PV system is not only prettier, but also not much more expensive. In Switzerland, we are pushing homeowners to install whole roof integrated systems.
Yeah, I mean, I like them, but at the time, actually, I didn't even have 17.5 at the time. This was done in 2 phases. So I had the first phase put on with a Sunny Boy inverter, and then the second part put on afterwards. So we were pretty much an early adopter, and 10 years ago, what you're talking about was not as common as it is now. So out in the country, with our metal roofs and the like, out in the we'll call it a semi-rural area, used to be rural, it's pretty common for people to have these solar panels on the roofs, and nobody thinks twice about them.
Thank you. So there's another question. How do people and clients react to these simulations? They are still pretty complex, aren't they? Do they really understand how they can benefit from all those measures?
That's a great question. So the idea is to provide the consumer primarily and the people evaluating what they might want to do for sustainable construction to show them break-even and effects on the environment, period. In terms of the underlying mathematics behind it, that part is for the academics in the group and for the people who want to go through and take a look under the hood and make sure that the assumptions are what they think they should be based upon the state of the science. But in terms of the consumer, that's what this is designed for, is a consumer way of evaluating what works and what doesn't for their area. So it's a great question. The under the hood, a lot of the average person is not going to understand what's going on under the hood. I'd argue that the average person probably doesn't understand what goes under the hood of a car either, though.
Sure, yeah. Thank you. So there's another question, but I really suggest that we switch back to our virtual networking room and continue our discussion there, because it's already almost 1:10. So yeah, you can use the same link to join the Remo networking platform if you're not logged in or if you're no longer logged in. And the next webinar session is going to start in about 20 minutes at 12:30, again on Zoom, and again you can use the same Zoom link. Yeah, thanks again to the 4 speakers who were fantastic. It was great. And yeah, now I hope to see many of you at the Remo tables now and to continue our conversation at Remo.
Next up, we have Philipp Heer, who is the Deputy Head at Urban Energy Systems Lab, Empa, and he'll be talking to us about fueling the energy transition with data-driven solutions. Philipp, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Before we start, I noticed a lot of presentations from Lucerne University, which I think is nice because 8 years ago I was working at Lucerne University myself, and since then at Empa, the Swiss Federal Research Institute for Material Science and Technology. We do mostly applied research with industry partners, which is mostly motivated by the Swiss Federal Energy Strategy 2050. I'm not going into the energy strategy itself, but rather 3 trends that we observed from this strategy. One is, I'm sure you've heard about this, decentralization, basically meaning getting away from central power plants, which are typically non-renewable, towards to decentral production. In Switzerland, this is typically PV installations, very decentral, on various roofs installed, trying to use as much renewable infrastructure as we have in Switzerland. We have a large part of hydro. Of course, this shall be taken over, and distribution and transmission grid to a large degree shall be used as well as it is. This is for the production side, decentralization. A second trend that we observed, we heard this already a bit with Jörg Worlitschek's presentation, sector coupling, thermal side, gas side, really important, but in terms of energy carrier, we see more a dominance of the electricity. especially in the mobility sector. So getting away from diesel and gasoline towards electricity-based mobility with the underlying assumption that the electricity used is produced renewably. And same in the heating sector. So domestic hot water, space heating and cooking, getting away from natural gas and oil, also again towards electricity-based technologies. Trend number 2, electrification. And the third one, this is where the fun is digitalization. Because when you think about it, all these new technologies which are decentrally implemented are run by microcontrollers. Every heat pump, every PV inverter, every charging station, every stove nowadays is run by microcontrollers which speak mostly at least IP, the Internet Protocol. So there are interfaces that we could use to run them more optimally, or not just individually. But when we look at the digital readiness levels of different sectors, we see that we don't use this don't use these interfaces, these possibilities from the digitalization. Compared to the benchmarks, mobility, for example, a modern car has around 100 underlying control circles, control loops governed by microcontrollers. And this is, which are highly integrated, so really dependent on each other. Also with logistics, supply chain management, consumables, we really don't have that in the energy sector. We are a follower, to put it nicely. It's not the idea to push the energy sector up here, but rather to learn from the benchmarks and apply it to the energy and building and construction sectors. How are we doing this at Empa? We built demonstrators. Three pieces of it. One we see here behind the tree, which is the mobility demonstrator. There we have charging stations, produce hydrogen for fueling stations and so on. Second one being NEST, the building and building technology demonstrator, where we have residential areas where students, people live, where we have office areas to have office energy profiles, recreational areas, saunas, a gym, to also cover that part. And combining NEST and the mobility demonstrator, we have our energy hub, basically integrating all technologies to a virtualized platform, which does not run on site, but somewhere virtualized on a data center from Swisscom, somewhere in Switzerland. And we provide all the data that we gather to researchers, to developers, to students, to work with our data, to use them for model, for visualization, for whatever, but also to develop control algorithms to basically be able to, from their program, feed back information to the actual charging station to have different charging patterns, to implement different blind controls for residential areas, to implement different ground heat exchange modes of operation with the heat pump, and so forth. You get the idea. So this is our playground. This is our sandbox where we test new ideas in real life for the commissioning and operational part of a building. Because until 2050, strategy-wise, most parts of the building will stay the same. Most parts of the technologies will stay the same. So we have to find ways to operate them more smartly. One specific example that goes a bit into the direction of Silvia from before, we heard about comfort and temperature control of a building. Here, assume this is a residential bedroom where we measure temperature, push this data up to our platform, and the student uses this information together with publicly available weather forecasts to derive a dynamic forecast of the thermal behavior of a room. Basically, it's able to estimate, okay, what's the room temperature going to be within the next couple of hours, to take certain actions, and certain actions means in this case to reduce the energy consumption used for heating or cooling, and to increase comfort at the same time. And here this was done purely data-driven, so we didn't implement any rule bases or first principles in the control methodology, but rather just black box, learn from data, please. And here we saw, okay, in 2 experiments with 2 room setups, we are able to save about 25% of energy for cooling compared to a standard controller, which is already nice. This is what you would assume from a predictive controller compared to a non-predictive one. And at the same time, reduce the comfort violations, so increase comfort drastically at the same time, which is a nice takeaway. You can achieve both increased comfort and reduced energy cost. Really nice example. You can find more about the project behind this QR code. This is one example of a project that we did. And to be a bit optimistic for the future, let's say, our demonstrators at the moment are quite specific in the way that they are implemented, meaning our interfaces, I picked just the simplest one. You can access some data points via URLs. You can try this at home. What you will get is a timestamp, a value, and this numeric ID that you queried for. I have to tell you that this is this room temperature on the second floor of a certain apartment. So this is machine readable, but not really understandable by humans that don't really work with the material of our documents and so on. In the construction world, there's this BIM progress, building information progress, where they try to aggregate the information that they have from the architect to HVAC, to electrical planning, and so on, to come up with one model that they can use to show if everything fits or not. Extending this with data that we gather or data points from technical systems is quite cumbersome and not standardized. Basically, we have to place the data points by hand, connect it by hand to any data sources that we can visualize some trends. And you can trash this for the next building project because every building is new. You have to parameterize anew. Now, wouldn't it be nice to have a resource description framework that allows transferability to different buildings, that makes it possible to compare different installations more or less on the fly and not to spend lots of time, a lot of effort into it. Basically getting away from just this simple line where I have to tell you what it is, but rather to be able to label this return air temperature sensor, which is part of a air handling unit, which has certain commands, status, which are, and this air handling unit is located in a room, in an apartment, on a certain floor in the nest building. The nice thing about that is everything red, green, and yellow is standardized and the same for every building. And everything blue is specific to our own implementation. We still need this degree of freedom, of course, to specify our own namespace, for example. But with that, we are certainly comparable without much effort. Reducing effort is key here. This is why there are data-driven solutions to everything, not having to parameterize everything by hand. And with that, we can be connected to not just our own little sandbox in real life, but to connect to other platforms such as the Remap project driven by ETH Zurich, where they access our infrastructure, use our infrastructure for simulations and also real life experiments. And they also access infrastructure at different sites in Switzerland, for example, PSI with their industry scale demonstrator. These are some developments that we try to push together with our partners. Okay, that will be it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you're interested, feel free to reach out right now, later on, or via my contacts.
Thank you. I would encourage the participants to ask questions, but in the meanwhile, given how much of the configuration needs to still be put in manually for each different building, how much time are you actually saving with the common elements?
It's of course tricky to estimate because on the one hand, every building is unique. It's quite rare, at least in Switzerland, to see similar buildings by the same architect. And this then as changes into, for the HVAC system, how the pipes remain and so on, the cabling. So to have, in this increased world of digitalized building automation systems or energy systems in general, we allocate about 10 to 15% of the building costs to automation. And this is if everything is done manually and everyone is in their own process. But if you can multiply this, I think you can decrease the cost drastically.
And is it realistic to introduce these such systems into retrofits?
Absolutely. You have to analyze, usually you go about soft retrofits. Basically, we also develop tools for to account for which would be the best retrofitting measure if you want to go step by step. And for that, you need an information base, which is typically a folder full of paper, where you need to have some grasp on what you want to achieve, what's the measure so far. So you need to work with the infrastructure that you're currently having, which is the first step into a scheme. And if you can not just pick a scheme, but a specific, generally a valid scheme, then you're basically 90% there.
Fantastic. And I think a final question then is you mentioned some partnerships and using this in different places. What's next beyond those test beds? Are you seeking to have this go more commercial?
We leave that to our partners. We are a research institute. We are really like to work with industry partners, and we use our sandbox really as a playground. Does an intended idea work? And this can be physical infrastructure, new furniture, but also, of course, as I highlighted, control schemes. And if this works out, we gladly give this to industry partners that they can participate in the market with that.
Great. So if anyone in the audience is interested, please check in with Philipp at the final networking session.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who we've actually met earlier in the day when we were talking with Via, but we'll be hearing from Ben Bowler again. He's a Senior Research Associate at Power Systems and Advanced Analytics Group at Lucerne, and he'll be speaking about innovation at the grid edge in Switzerland. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Alicia, and good afternoon or good evening, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are. So today I'll be giving an insight into some of the applied research that we're doing at the university at the grid edge, as well as providing a brief commentary on some of the forces at play outside the university that make this a really interesting time to be working on technology development at the grid edge. So just very briefly, for those who weren't present in the earlier presentation, I know the numbers have been fluctuating a little bit. Today I am focusing on the Institute of Electrical Engineering at the university, and we undertake applied research activities that cover cyber-physical systems, physical energy systems, and intelligent devices. I should also mention that we work closely with other parts of the university. For example, we work with the Power Economy Competence Center, which conducts techno-economic and business model analysis related to the industry, as well as with Jörg's team on sector coupling and integration of heat and other vectors, and so on in the topics. So we don't work in isolation, we work closely with those other groups. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a University of Applied Sciences partnerships with industry are critical. And we're strongly driven by the commercial ambitions of our partners, as you saw from our earlier presentation with VIA. So just to say again a little bit more about the sorts of areas where we're active in research and teaching, I apologize for those that's repetition. This slide covers some of our thematic areas. We focus on intelligent energy systems, on smart and embedded systems, smart living, and autonomous systems and robotics. But it's going to be the intelligent energy systems thematic area that I'll focus on in the presentation this afternoon. So for the presentation, I want to focus in particular on cyber-physical energy systems, on data acquisition and advanced analytics and peer-to-peer markets in relation to developments at the grid edge. And I also want to touch briefly on our mood music, that is to give an idea about what's going on around us as a university, and also hope to give you a bit of an insight into what's on our innovation radar by giving some examples of our ongoing research activities in this area. I hope that by doing so, I'll be able to explain why Switzerland's a really interesting place to conduct applied research in these areas at the moment. And hopefully that will trigger a conversation about how we can extend what we do at the moment into new projects and new relationships. So I wanted to start with a quick look at some of the projects, some of the aspects that we're tracking. So recent developments here in Switzerland, and this is by no means a comprehensive description, but I hope it gives an insight into some of the things that are driving some of the applied research at the grid edge. And so our focus for current and future research activities. And one area that is of particular interest at the moment is the ongoing revision of the Electricity Supply Act. And I've shared a couple of extracts from recent press releases on the screen. The changes are in consultation at the moment, but they're expected to go into force on January the 1st, 2021. So looking first at the box on the left, the Federal Council will open the retail markets to all consumers as part of this amendment. And while this opening up of the retail market took place in a number of other countries a number of years ago, in my opinion, some of the parameters that form part of this revision in Switzerland make it a really, really interesting case. So I just touch on a couple of those now. So firstly, customers will be able to switch tariffs, but the default basic supply, if they're not active in the retail market, should consist of 100% renewable energy. And this, I expect, will drive large growth, in particular of PV, because that's the main part of the story here in Switzerland. That will create pressing need for new technology at the grid edge, which will support renewable energy integration. Also, the Federal Council will be able to launch tenders for domestic renewable production capacities to support security of supply. And this will certainly have, because it's domestic, it will certainly have an impact and drive increased levels of behind the meter generation, and so grid edge technologies associated with those. There's another interesting aspect. By law, producers, end users and storage operators will become owners of their flexibility. This will drive innovation in markets, it'll drive data analytics, and also promotes distributed control systems, the sort of things that we've just been hearing about with the previous presentation and some of the earlier presentations as well. Also, as a result of these changes, anyone who produces solar energy will be able to sell that excess energy in their neighborhood. And this will really drive district electricity markets and energy communities. It will take them to the next level. So that's the box on the left. Looking on the right, the changes will also clarify access to smart meter data. So in future, distribution system operators will need to make smart meter data available on request, especially as a data export. So this should create some really opportunities for applied research relating to analytics at the meter as data becomes more readily available and the consumer is opened up to the possibility of energy services and participation in energy services markets in a way that they haven't been able to previously. Part of the provisions also include the requirement to create a national data hub, and a dialogue process has been opened up by the Swiss Federal Office of Energy. And this is a schematic from a presentation that was given at the end of April, which was when the dialogue process was initiated. And we hope that the data hub will increase data availability, drive data-based innovation, and also create new research opportunities. And we especially see this being the case if the data infrastructure is developed in a phased, flexible way, ideally prioritizing aspects that allow early implementation of innovation related to data, such as artificial intelligence, so enabling innovation to take place as early as possible. And as a university, we hope to be actively involved in the Swiss Federal Office of Energy's development of some of these building blocks through research projects, and would be very interested to explore project ideas with potential partners around this theme. So in summary, we see opportunities behind the meter, at the meter, within communities and for prosumers, and also in the network, all underpinned by data access, by data analysis, and by decision-making that can be based on the insights that can be obtained from the data. So that's our mood music, that's the context. I'd now like to highlight 4 research activities or projects that show what's going on to give you an insight into our innovation radar, if you like, and to show how we're already driving innovation that's taking place at the grid edge. The first, and the one that's on the slide at the moment, is called non-intrusive load monitoring balancing for the grid. And this project uses machine learning to disaggregate load and generation using smart meter data. And by quantifying customer load shifting potential, their flexibility can be offered as a service. And this this project should allow the consumer to offer flexibility to, for example, energy distribution companies or retailers, which will then allow them to take advantage of changes to the Electricity Supply Act, which I mentioned earlier. So that's the first. The second project called Knowledge is something that we've been developing with VIA, along with a couple of other partners, Landis and Gear, and also Revaz Energy. This project's not yet started, but hopefully it will investigate the advantages of using distributed analysis as an alternative to centralizing data for various use cases that are relevant to the distribution system operator. And the project will also investigate the possibility of conducting analysis on the smart meter itself, which will reduce the need for cloud-based AI or machine learning, and also alleviating issues to do with data privacy or permissions. Hopefully the project will support the valorization of smart meter data and will also help the DSO to manage the anticipated growth in renewable energy. The third project that I'd like to highlight is called ENET. We're working with the Liechtenstein DSO LKW and Virtual Global Trading to implement what will be the largest peer-to-peer community in the world. Virtual Global Trading are developing the energy trading platform, and we as a university are responsible for introducing a dynamic network tariff model that will encourage trading, that will reduce congestion by promoting trade to take place between neighbors. So the platform will go online in January 2021, and our part, the grid tariff part, will hopefully go online in July 2021. And this really interesting project has given us a great opportunity to be directly involved in the development of peer-to-peer markets, both in Switzerland and globally. We also lead one of the subtasks of the International Energy Agency's Global Peer-to-Peer Observatory, specifically relating to power systems integration of peer-to-peer markets. And this gives us an opportunity to support research across the world using lessons that are coming out of the ENET project. Finally, I'd just like to mention a group of research activities that are clustered under the title AIR, or Autonomous Integrated Renewable Energy Systems. This program of work was submitted to the SFOE SUEID call, which you've heard about earlier. This is a 136 million franc program for energy research that covers research from 2021 to 2028. And Mr. Revaz mentioned this in the keynote presentation. So the theme is on automation, on autonomous operation of resources in a decarbonized network. There's a strong emphasis on the exploitation of data using AI and machine learning. However, as an important part of this project will be human factors and business models that will also play a part. So we have got 19 potential partners that have expressed an interest in being involved in the project, in the consortium, and we started looking at the building blocks that would help us develop research projects in relation to this theme, either through SUEID or via other funding sources. Should also mention we've got a number of complementary activities ongoing in relation to this. For example, we're currently undertaking a project where we quantify commercial and operational benefits of AI for energy sector stakeholders, and we're developing a sandbox for AI that should allow users to increase their familiarity with some of these tools. So to finish, I'd like to just finish there with an invitation to speak further. So we'd be very pleased to discuss projects in the thematic areas that I've described in the last few minutes. And in particular, we're growing our competence in advanced analytics and power systems, and we'd be really, really pleased to discuss future projects in this area. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. That was a fascinating presentation and clearly a lot of work happening in your institution. We have a question from Marianne Zund at the Swiss Federal Office of Energy. She says that the Swiss Federal Office is pushing these sorts of initiatives, but it's hard to explain the benefits of data hubs, open electricity market, et cetera, to people and also to politicians, so consumers. Do you have a killer argument to convince them that this is something that should be done?
I'd have to think carefully about it, but at the moment the data is trapped, and this is something that I think Joe alluded to in his presentation earlier, so it's difficult for researchers to access data. It's difficult to allow the technology to move forward. It's difficult even for the businesses that should have proprietary ownership of the data, for example, DSOs. In the conversations that we had with Revaz Energy regarding the Knowledge project, they expressed a real interest in some of the research themes that we were looking at in that project, because they've got very strict regulatory boundaries around what they're able to do with data. So we see the Data Hub as a way of accessing and exploiting data in a controlled way that secures the safeguards of people who are providing that data, but at the same time allowing it to be exploited and for the energy system and indeed those providers of the data to benefit from it. So yeah, releasing the data and untrapping this, I think, would be the main killer argument to allow innovation and research to take place.
And are there any types of on-site data that currently are not measured, but would be very valuable for you to have?
The measurements associated with residential smart meters, for example, are currently quite limited. The number of outputs that are available for analysis, available for services, are quite limited. So I think increasing the value of, or increasing the depth of understanding associated with consumer behaviour would be particularly useful. And there are two ways you can do that, and I think we've heard a couple of different ways. One is to cover buildings with sensors, and that gives you a really useful insight into consumer behaviour. The second way is the sort of approach that's described in the NILM project that I mentioned, which is about disaggregating load data and understanding, trying to understand behaviours and to profile consumers without actually having to deploy those sensors. But really it's behaviour. It's being able to predict behaviour. It's being able to cluster people and to understand what groups behave and in what way, and what impact that behaviour will have on the network in the context of fluctuating variable renewable energy resources.
Great. I think we have time for one more. From Duane Jonlin, one of our other panelists, he asked, it seems that residents of any one neighborhood would produce solar energy on the same schedule and use energy on the very similar schedule. So will they have a real need to trade energy?
They're driven by a number of different aspects, and so they may choose. So some of what we're finding through the UNEP project is that people are sometimes really motivated to be self-sufficient. So actually they will choose to adapt their behavior within this self-consumption community to make sure that their load and demand profiles aren't all the same across the community. But also this project, this peer-to-peer project, will allow trading between communities as well. So it should allow people to organize themselves through the market platform and to trade with others elsewhere in the network that might have a different demand profile or might have slightly different generation profiles.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ben. We really appreciate the presentation. We are on to our final presenter, last but not least. I'd like to welcome Doug Taylor to the virtual stage. He is the COO at Texas PACE Authority and will be speaking to us today about transferable clean energy financing, PACE. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alicia. Make sure my slides go up. Is that good?
They look great.
All right, thanks. So yeah, finishing up here with, this is going to be a pretty non-technical presentation, but this is about a key question and helping overcome that hurdle, and that's how to pay for this. So many of the things we've heard about today require some level of investment with a longer term return. And we have at least one model operating in many of the states in the US that we think can help overcome that capital hurdle. So I'm going to talk about PACE, which is really transferable clean energy project financing, a solution. So what is PACE? The letters stand for Property Assessed Clean Energy. And then really what's missing is financing, because this is a financing tool. And what it does is it allows the owners to make upgrades in their facility infrastructure, energy and water related, really with no initial capital outlay. No upfront cost or out-of-pocket expense in many cases. So the owners can take the operating costs, the reduction, the utility savings, and redirect those toward the investment in the capital project itself. And then the return on that pays back over a longer period. In some cases, we have two states, California actually includes seismic hardening is something eligible for PACE there. And in Florida, they do something similar for hurricane hardening prevention. So depending on the locality, it can be tailored to those needs and those local circumstances. The key to this all is that when a PACE loan is made, there is an assessment that's placed on the property that is access security for the lender. And the assessment can be on the property for as long as 30 years, 20, 30 years. Typically, it's on the property for as long as the average weighted useful life of the project. And that enables these longer payback projects to be financed over these longer terms, and again, to be cash flow positive from day one. So the way this looks, if the graph on the left shows really a conventional financing model for any sort of clean energy or water conservation upgrades. Assuming the owner does not have the capital, does not have the budget, which is usually the case, they're going to need to secure financing to pay for that. The equipment is typically financed in an unsecured manner. So that means that the term of the repayment is shorter, and it's also higher in the first, during that shorter repayment term than the utility savings. So you're upside down financially. You're cash flow negative during that repayment term. Also, because it's unsecured, the interest rate from the borrower may be higher, because in the event of a default, the likelihood of that lender coming in and removing the equipment is pretty low. And so they reflect that in the interest that they charge. If you look at the model on the right, and this is the PACE model, you're recovering, your payment is longer over a longer term. By design, it is equal to or less than the utility savings during that time, and so you're cash flow positive from day one. Again, this is enabled through the assessment mechanism that's associated with the project itself. And in a redevelopment, and this is an actual project that we were involved in, where an abandoned warehouse in an urban area was being repurposed for a combination of residential condominium living as well as a hotel. The entire project was over $100 million, $116 million, and typically this is what the capital stack looks like for a project like this. You may have a significant amount of senior debt. You've got, in this case, some tax credits that contributed, owner's equity, but then this gap that's circled here is usually picked up through some sort of mezzanine financing. In this case, $22 million at 15% interest, very high, and that's not uncommon for a mezzanine loan. What we're able to do in this project is to identify what were the energy and water projects or measures in this reconfiguration, move those off, finance that through PACE for about $24 million, but at a much lower interest. And that brought the average cost of capital for the entire project down 20%. So very appealing to the developer, and that's why they decided that PACE made sense in this sort of a scenario. Looking at it from a cash flow standpoint, here's another actual example, about $1 million upgrade, projected savings of about $125,000 a year. The graph that's on the right, the self-funded option assumes that the owner has the money to make the investment, but again, they go cash flow negative from day one, having made that investment of $1.1 million, and then they begin realizing benefits from there. The conventional loan option, during that term, you're negative from a cash flow standpoint, and then you begin recovering. And then from PACE perspective, what you see is the increase in the line maybe is more gradual, but it's more deliberate over time, and you're cash flow from day one. So again, very appealing from an investor and owner standpoint. The types of things that are eligible, and this is a Texas list, although in other states we see very similar sorts of things being eligible for PACE. Anything that reduces energy or water consumption or generates energy on site is eligible for PACE potentially. So these are examples of the different types of technologies. Many of these have been discussed today. The discussion earlier on adding air conditioning systems in Switzerland and the higher cost of some of the higher efficiency equipment, this can be a means of providing financing for that sort of equipment. So water, renewable distributed generation systems, rooftop solar, anything like that potentially can be eligible. And really, if you step back and look at it, this is one of those scenarios that really is a win-win-win for a number of entities. The property owners, they have lower utility bills. In the case of a lease property where maybe it's a multifamily where the owner, there's a split incentive, they're not incented to necessarily make the investments to lower energy and water costs for their tenants. They can make those investments and pass them through as an operating cost. And then the tenants receive a lower energy or utility bill as a result of that. Property values increase. These are investments back into the properties themselves. From a contractor's standpoint, this is a new business opportunity. These projects get done typically by local contractors, and so that helps not only with their business, but it helps keep them abreast of latest technologies. The lenders that are providing capital for these projects, this is a fully collateralized, very secure. Communities here on the screen, increased economic development, improving building stock, redevelopment in some of the maybe urban areas where you have abandoned properties, they can be repurposed. And then societal benefits of enhanced grid reliability, improved air quality, water conservation. So where is PACE in the US? We have 37 states active. This is not a federally enabled legislation. This is done state by state and then ultimately local by local. So we have the areas there, that the states that you see shaded green have active programs. The ones that are lighter green are in development. And then the ones that are sort of the tan colored are ones where PACE legislation has been passed, but there's no program yet. And then in Texas, again, this is a very decentralized situation where it has to be adopted at the county or city level. And we have 46 cities and counties that we're working with now, covering about 60% of the population where PACE financing is offered. Our organization, the Texas PACE Authorities, really sits in the middle. We work for the local governments as the administrator of their program. Any property owner can participate, any capital provider can finance the projects, and any service provider can actually do the work. So we're in the middle and help facilitate the projects. In Texas, there's been an inflection point. If you look at the bar graph on the right, it was a slow start, but last year we did about $50 million in projects, and that was as many from a dollar standpoint as had been done in the prior 3 years. This year, in spite of COVID restrictions, we've seen a decently strong start with some new projects in the pipeline as well. Most of these energy efficiency, some water conservation, and then distributed generation as well. A lot in the commercial and retail, hotel, commercial office space area. And I should say that in Texas, PACE is available just for commercial and industrial properties. Some states have it for residential as well. In Texas, it's just commercial and industrial. So looking forward, some of the challenges, and this has been talked about already, half of the energy in the US is used to operate buildings. This is a big piece of the overall energy consumption pie, and it's increasing. The red line on the graph on the left shows electricity consumption. A lot of that is plug load related. It's also related to the fact that we're air conditioning many more square feet a lot more often than we used to. And then the challenge on the right is our energy costs in the US are pretty low. And so if you try to do a calculation and finance these projects based on ROI from a savings standpoint, it takes a long time. And you really do need a different sort of financial mechanism like PACE to facilitate that. So how can we work together? This model may be transferable to Switzerland in some parts. The real estate and tax administration system is similar enough to what we have in the US that this sort of a financing model may be able to be used in Switzerland. And then also a challenge we have is that all the projects we've done to date have been sort of one-off, really custom bespoke type projects. And we think there's huge opportunity to scale, but we don't really have an efficient way of doing baseline calculations for potential property candidates on a remote basis in a cost-effective way, assessing the savings opportunities, and then measuring the impact. So we're looking for ideas in those areas. And these are current service providers that are working in the space, don't yet offer services and tools like this. So any ideas are welcome in that area. In terms of follow-on resources, this presentation will be posted along with the others. So here are some links. The case studies I think are interesting, and they're actually at the tail end of this slide deck as resources. I won't go into those, but you can see how the projects actually come together. And with that, I will stop and see if there are any questions.
Great, thank you. I think there are a number of questions that are coming in around the organization of Texas PACE and how it's funded, and also how that contributes to the sort of the pricing to the end user. So if you could touch on that, that would be very helpful.
So the way we're structured in Texas is it's considered an open market system, meaning that any, as I showed in one of the slides, any capital provider, any contractor, any owner, can all participate. We sit in the middle as a facilitator. It's operated, there's essentially a transaction fee that supports our work on the front end. It's usually collected at closing. It's 1% of the project value up to a certain amount. I don't recall what the threshold is, so it's capped. And that goes to pay for the administration services that we provide. The capital providers, the interest rate's going to vary by their risk tolerance, by the type of project. We've seen typically interest rates anywhere from probably in the 5 to 7% range, which typically is a little bit lower than you could get from just a commercial lender for an equipment refinancing project or financing project. And then the cost of the project itself is going to be dependent on local market conditions and whatever contractors bid in. So it's very, very localized, but the administration component of it is generally done at closing on a percentage of a project basis.
Great, thank you. As this rolls out to new communities, do you have any advice for the communities to get started or best practices for operating under PACE's strategies?
As this rolls out to new communities, it is very important really to have kind of a local advocate. Can be a local politician, it could be the local economic development corporation, someone that is sort of looking past the technology and the project itself into the overall benefits to the community. And where we've had good success and good uptake, we've had leaders like that. And it's usually a county judge, a mayor, could be, again, a local economic development person who sees the value in this. So that's really, I think, been a key ingredient.
And I think finally, you mentioned in Texas that this is only available for commercial projects. In the states or locations where it is allowed to be used for residential, is it available to small buildings or single family homes, or is it only really for larger residential properties?
So in the states where residential is available, it is available for single family residential, so single family homes. California is where the PACE concept started. Berkeley, actually the city of Berkeley was the first organization or entity to roll this out. And the idea there was you have tax assessments that pay for common public infrastructure that has very long paybacks, roads, bridges, things like this. And the idea was, why couldn't you have an assessment mechanism like that on an individual property that would help cover the costs of the improvements and then deliver the same sort of public benefits long term. And so it really did spin out of kind of a residential situation. It's a very different, residential is a very different business. It's very volume driven, and transactions oftentimes are driven by local contractors. This is a financing tool they have in their toolbox. The commercial projects and the industrial projects that we're involved in Texas tend to be more complex, usually higher dollar amount involved, multi-measure, generally engineers involved. So it really varies. But yeah, in the states that offer residential single family is typically in scope.
Great. I would encourage anyone who still has questions for Dub to find him at the final networking session, which will begin in just a few moments. Before we jump into that, I do want to thank all of our speakers today for sharing their research programs, their products, their strategies, and their analysis. I think we've come out smarter than when we started, but perhaps with more questions, which is the way that we should perhaps end a conference. I also want to give another thank you to our collaborators, Swiss Next San Francisco, as well as the Swiss Federal Office of Energy, and my co-organizer, Diego Sigrist, who made this all possible. And I want to encourage everyone to keep the conversations going that started today, whether that's at this networking session that follows my last words, or whether it's through LinkedIn, through emails, through coffee when it's possible to have coffee together again. And of course, to look forward to next year's meeting, which will hopefully be in person. So in the meanwhile, we thank you for your contributions to energy. We thank you for your contributions to the conversation today. And we wish you all to stay safe and healthy and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.